one poem and three composers. This video is going to look at Thomas Hardy's Proud Songsters, and that appears as part of Britain's Hardy cycle, Winter Words, and also as the final song in Gerald Finzi's cycle, Earth and Air and Rain. And the third composer is me, because at the moment I'm composing an opera called Timeless Figure for the September 2020 Tete-a-Tete Opera Festival, which we're very hopeful is going to go live. And I've chosen the first stanza only of Thomas Hardy's poem as the opening of the whole work. And the timeless element of Timeless Figure is reflected there in Hardy's poem, because Proud Songsters, like so many of Hardy's poems, reflects on the idea that what we are conscious of in our everyday lives as passing time is as nothing to the huge swathes of time and eternity of which we will never know anything, both in the past and in the future. The idea of putting Finzi and Britain side by side is not to compare them, but rather it's to reflect how a poetic text can evoke very different musical realizations of its content. So I'm not focusing on what Hardy means and whether Britain's meaning or Finzi's meaning is right or wrong, because what both those composers have done is to respond to suggestions or evocations in Hardy's poem. And it's interesting that Hardy's interest in this idea is reflected in so many of his poems. So the first poem of Britain's cycle, Day Close in November, has the same idea. The children in it have no concept that there was a time when the trees amongst which they play weren't there, and that there will be a time in the future when those trees are not there either. Why should we look at different composers' settings side by side? Because hopefully by doing so we gain a greater understanding of each composer's approach to their work. Each has their own integrity, and only by acknowledging this will we do each composer justice and open our ears to their music. And Finzi and Britten, they have some similarities, but they are very distinctive when compared with each other. Britten chooses to set his song in 5/4, so quite a regular metre, and he marks it impetuously. It's a very forward-driving setting. Finzi, by contrast, chooses a time signature of 4/4, but there is some flexibility in that, as we'll explore in a moment at the piano. So he has 4/4 and in an andante marking, so quite measured, quite reflective, as befits the song's position as the final title of the cycle. For me, the timeless aspect of Hardy's poem is what is so attractive, because the character in my opera is in fact a clockmaker over 3 centuries, representing the same family that made clocks in Whitchurch in Shropshire for that period of time. So it's not an actual human being, but he embodies this idea of timelessness, of much greater swathes of time. And so Thomas Hardy's first stanza is very attractive to open the work, and particularly because the opening movement is for solo clarinet and solo baritone alone, I can focus on the idea of the birds that, as Hardy describes them, whistle in ones and pairs. So there are so many aspects of Hardy's poem that one can alight on, and we'll now go to the piano and look at some of the ways in which Britten and Finzi fulfil their ideas. Britten very much focuses on the birds in his setting of the poem, and they're apparent from the very beginning of the song in the piano introduction, where they trill away and they move up and down in parallel added note chords. Britten's exuberant setting of Hardy's poem. And the tenor voice comes in quite high pitched in the voice. It starts on an E flat. So very much pitched in that area between E flat and G, which was the epicenter really of Peter Pears's voice, for whom the cycle was written. And Britten often sets music for Pears in that range. If you want the best example of that, it's the aria "Now the Great Bear in Pleiades" from the opera Peter Grimes, where Peter Grimes sings on an E almost all the way through that aria. Both Britten and Finzi set the second stanza of Hardy's poem in a reflective way, though Britten then builds up the excitement again so that he ends with this exuberance, this idea of rebirth and of ongoing creation. For Hardy, it's very much the line that the sun is going, I think, which sets the mood for his setting. If we listen to the opening of the introduction, which is a very long introduction, it serves both as an introduction to this song, but also, to an extent, I think, as a postlude to the whole of the cycle. I've just gone into that second idea of the introduction. We hear the regular rhythms, a lot of dotted rhythms, which I'll come back to in the piano accompaniment. But then the music also moves to more chromatic music. And also it's bracketed together in the score to make groupings, rather than pairings, groupings of three crotchets. So although the piece begins in 4/4, Finzi then moves into these groups of three. So it's not just Britten who plays around with metre in his setting of the song. Now these dotted rhythms are very important because they're part of Finzi's idiomatic setting of Hardy's text. If we listen to the opening, the thrushes sing as the sun is going, and the finches whistle in ones and pairs. So we get the dotted rhythm for ones and pairs, or the sun is going. When we get to going, as we had for thrushes, Finzi inverts the dotted rhythm. So it's semiquaver, dotted quaver. The thrushes sing. And as I say, it's very much idiomatic setting of Hardy's text. Now, this rhythmic sense of dotted notes dies down in the second stanza. The only inverted rhythms that occur there are on growing and our old friends thrushes. But all the other rhythms seem to be ironed out in this beautiful second stanza. Although when I perform the whole of the second stanza in a moment, you'll notice that as the music comes towards the close of the poem, particles of grain and earth and everything seems to be ironed out. Of course, grain and earth and are in fact that dotted rhythm augmented to be a dotted crotchet and a quaver, where before it was a dotted quaver and a semiquaver. We also think in this final stanza, that the music has reached a tranquility where we've had chromaticism earlier on in the piece. It's reached a tranquility of D major. And that certainly is the way that it appears to be going. And again, it serves as a coda, as a postlude, however you want to describe it, to the whole cycle, as well as to this song. Because remember, Earth and Air and Rain is the title for the whole cycle. So here is that last page. These are brand new birds of 12-month growing, which a year ago less than twain no finches were, no nightingales, no thrushes. And of course we know what's going to come next. There's going to be a lovely chord of D major to end the whole song. Especially after that beautiful, typical Finzi-esque falling phrase, rather similar to what we were talking about in the slow movement of the cello concerto in the previous video. But there are lots of Finzi enthusiasts shaking their heads at the moment because they know that actually after that D major comes a return to the B minor of the opening of the song, and also to the chromatic uncertainty and dissonance of some of the passages there. For me, it's a masterly ending, particularly that last triad, which seems to go on into infinity. One of those musical chords that carries on when the music actually stops in our minds. It takes us into that infinity that Hardy was considering in his poem.
Thrushes sing as the sun is going, and the finches whistle, 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 whistle in